Hello, good morning. Welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, episode number 182. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service, which has 4 archive centres in the Highlands of Scotland, in Inverness, in Wick, in Portree and in Fort William. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland and there is no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we are very, very grateful for that. And thank you, as always, to those of you who I know have done that. It really does make a difference to us. Please do get in touch, say hello, say where you're watching from, if this is your first episode or lots of them. I keep finding out when I'm doing events and speaking at things that people will say to me, oh, I've watched Learn with Lorna for ages, but I never comment. So if you want to, say hello to me today. It makes a difference for me not speaking into the ether, so thank you for doing that. So this week we are returning to a subject that we've looked at before, but again we're using a regional focus so that we're focusing on one particular part of the country. We're revisiting the subject of poor relief, and this time looking at poor relief specifically in Caithness. So huge thanks to my colleague Val in Nucleus, who has put together a presentation which she used to give a talk a while ago and which I have shamelessly used to pull together this episode. So thank you very much to Val. To remind you, we're going to start with some of the legislation around this subject and the change in the systems and the people who were responsible for poor relief over time. So from 1579 until 1845, so a huge chunk of time, the Kirk Session and the heritors, the landowners of each parish, were officially responsible for the care of the poor within their bounds. And we can find examples of this within the Kirk Session records, Kirk Session minute books and so on. The Kirk Session, as many of you will be aware, being the lowest level of church court, the local level, the minister and the elders of one specific parish. And it was them who dealt with the administration of the poor funds within that particular area. So having a look at Kirk Session records means that we can find some information about distribution of poor funds within that area. So for example, if we look at the records of Lathering Kirk Session, we can see that in 1839 there were various people on the estate of Dunbeath receiving assistance. For instance, Widow Sutherland was receiving 4 shillings and 6pence. James Sutherland Elder was receiving 10 shillings and James Bruce's mother was receiving 4 shillings. So you do get a record of the fact that this poor relief is being distributed, that people are in need, but not always a huge amount of specific detail there. So for instance, James Bruce's mother, we're not getting a huge amount of detail about her there. If we go back a bit further, a look through the Caithness records. Incidentally, if you're ever interested in looking at Caithness, beautiful, crisp, clear writing from the 1650s, very, very clear. And we can see in a 1652 entry that just has even less detail than James Bruce's mother. It says, money given to poor man. So we do find that through all Kirk Sessions that there's reference to someone probably has arrived in the area that they don't know, but it's clear that they're in need, so they'll just say money was allocated to a poor person or a poor man. There are others named even in the 1600s. Some Kirk Sessions have their poor payments listed separately from their minutes. Usually you find the lists of names or discussions about poor funds in amongst all the Kirk Session minutes, but sometimes you do find them taken out and listed separately, and that can be very useful, not only because it means you're not wading through all the antenuptial fornication and the other things that are in Kirk Session records to find poor relief, but also because it doesn't just include the names of the people receiving relief, but often it will reveal where the funds have come from to pay for it. So for instance, in the parish of Ray, the poor relief entries have been copied into from the minute books into one volume. And we find entries like this from May 1845 key date for poor relief legislation. We find this entry from May 1845, where a group have met to discuss the state of the poor's funds. And I think you'll agree with me that it doesn't sound like you would want to be poor in the parish of Ray at this point. The said Alexander Dunbar, Esquire, was unanimously chosen as the chairman. Thereafter, the said Mr. I think it's Snowdy, stated to the meeting that the number of paupers in this parish receiving parochial aid was around 120, and that the last regular distribution was in the month of June 1844. So it's been nearly a year since they've given out any poor funds. And he says that when that last payment was made, the sum of £30 1 shillings was distributed, and since then a balance of £2 14 shillings and 5p halfpenny, together with £3 8 shillings of church collection, was distributed amongst the most necessitous since the commencement of the present year. So, as usual, never use one word where 15 words will do. Get used to that. The meeting, having taken into consideration the above statement, so the fact that they've not distributed money for a year, and taking specially to their consideration the state of the poor in this parish under the present circumstances, so it doesn't mention specifically what they are, but from our own knowledge, 1840s, we're probably looking at crop failure, we're probably looking at potentially cholera as well. So their specific circumstances that this group are meeting to say, we agree that the sum of £40 sterling should be taken out of the poor's funds presently in the commercial bank in Thurso and distributed by the minister and a committee to be named among the poor resident within this parish, after the roll has been properly investigated and purged. So want to go through that roll, make sure everybody on it is still eligible, get rid of anybody who is not truly necessitous in their eyes. So they've given power to the minister and to this group, this committee, to be able to undertake this work. But they finish by saying it needs to be distinctly understood that the present distribution is only intended as a temporary measure to supply present wants until it is seen whether the bill presently pending in Parliament for the general support of the poor will pass into law. And that's why I said this entry is from a particularly kind of key date around poor relief. And we can see that they met again a few days later, having met and having gone through that roll, and also they announced from the pulpit that anyone who wasn't on the roll who felt they were deserving of poor relief could apply to them. And so they met and interviewed 5 new claimants, or they received 5 new claims. Some of them didn't show up for their interview, but they reviewed their existing poor roll as well, and this was their conclusion. The committee, after going over the roll, distributed money among the poor, the sum of £19 12 shillings as aliment and gratuities for the 4 months up to September, and paid over to Alexander Fraser, ground officer, £11 sterling to be distributed among the poor on the Duke of Sutherland's estate in this parish. So Duke of Sutherland, although we're in a different county, still having land across the border. A list of 10 persons requiring weekly allowances was made out, and Mr. Joseph Mackay kindly undertook to supply the sum at such rates as shall be determined. So they're taking nominated people who will be responsible for distributing the poor within certain areas within the parish. If we carry on looking through these extracts, we find payments for medical relief, payments for funeral expenses, and support to someone just described as an insane and bedridden poor woman. I also found a really interesting entry in this volume where a pauper dies and her son presents her funeral expenses to the Kirk Session, and they take charge of any effects that she had left for the Poor's Fund. So she has been a pauper, her son has come and said, please can you help me pay the funeral costs, and they've said yes we can, but anything she's left we are taking and putting back into the poor funds for the next person that needs it. Quite interesting. And in that instance I can say I absolutely did found that entry, because that was something additional that I looked at, so I am not robbing Val of any credit there. So these entries, as I mentioned, date from a really interesting time. That reference to seeing whether the new Act currently pending in Parliament would pass into law. The Royal Inquiry of 1843 removed responsibility, official responsibility anyway, of the poor from the Church, and in 1845 the Poor Law Scotland Act established a system of parochial boards, overseen by a central board in Edinburgh. These parochial boards went on to become the parish councils in 1894. There was still a system of entitlement. There was still a system where people had to prove, again, that necessitous need, and also had to prove that they had a legitimate claim on a certain area, either through birth or through 7 years of residency. But a key part of this system, thank goodness from our point of view, was record keeping. And there's an immediate swing post 1845 to a standardised record keeping system. There were different types of poor relief within the gift of this new system that had been created. People applying for help who now needed to, unlike in the Kirk Sessions, these people now needed to record the details of their poverty, why they were claiming, what their need was. When they had done that, they could be offered either indoor relief or outdoor relief, or they could be denied anything at all, and that's pretty common in a system that is designed to be deliberately hard, deliberately harsh, so as to discourage people from applying unless they're in absolutely dire circumstances. So they could be given indoor relief or outdoor relief. And indoor was admission to a poor house. There were many poor houses built following the Poor Law Scotland Act, either one for a parish, or if it was a particularly sparsely populated area, then it could be a combined poor house or a union poor house for several parishes, and we'll come back to that. This might have been the case, so people might have been granted indoor relief if they were in need of sort of hospital type care, or in the case of orphans who had no near relatives to care for them. So different circumstances where care in your own house wasn't going to be appropriate. Because that was the alternative from indoor relief, was outdoor relief, which was support given to an individual in their own home, usually in the form of money, but we also see evidence of clothing being given, boots, blankets, medical attendance, payments of children's school fees, things like that. Both indoor and outdoor relief carried stigma with them, but I would think more stigma of being seen to go into the poorhouse. And there was a set process to go through to apply for poor relief assistance. People would apply to the inspector of the poor for that parish. He would then do an initial inspection, usually within 24 hours, and would do an immediate disposal if needed. So for instance, he had the authority to say, until we know a decision, I've given this person 4 shillings or whatever it might be. The case would then be discussed at the next meeting of the parochial board or the parish council later on, and the person applying would then either be refused or be admitted onto the poor roll, the general register of poor for that parish. When they're added onto the general register of poor, that's the moment that they become a pauper, and they would be then supported by the parish council or parochial board until they were removed from the roll, either through death or through a change in circumstance. It's a fairly gruelling process. It's all done within the local community with little or no anonymity, particularly in areas that were, again, sparsely populated, where people would know those who were coming to their door asking for help. So let's have a look at some of those from Caithness who needed to call on that poor relief system. A reminder here that all of the records to do with poor relief, the applications, the general registers of poor and so on, these all have a 100-year closure period on them to protect people who are living. So I won't refer to anything after 1924 today. So we'll start with Donald Sutherland, who we came across through a death certificate. And that's usually, I mean, it might seem a bit counterintuitive that I'm going to start with a death and then tell his story backwards, but actually that's often how people come to encounter poor relief records. If they're researching their family tree, then they may well find someone described as a pauper in a census or on a death certificate, and then this is what you would do next to uncover that story. So Donald Sutherland's death certificate records that he died on February the 28th, 1881, at the age of 56. He was recorded as a spinner and rope maker, married to Belle Innes, Both his parents are recorded as deceased, and he was resident when he died in the Latheron poorhouse. Now, I mentioned about the poorhouses where you could either get one per parish or a union combined poorhouse. Now, Caithness had two combination poorhouses, one in Latheron, and so that was where he was at the time of his death. And using that information on the death certificate, our next step then is to see if poor relief records exist for the areas covered by Latheron Poorhouse, which was Latheron and Wick. And so that's usually what people would do next if they're doing their own research. They would find someone registered as a pauper or noted as a pauper, and then see if there are poor relief records for that area. So we can find, as I mentioned, Latheron covers two areas. It covers Latheron Parish and Wick. And we found an entry in the Wick record of applications for poor relief. On the 10th of January 1880, a Donald Sutherland, 55-year-old lodger with James Calder, tailor, on Telford Street. He's recorded as being a native of Wick, and is a note of his application for assistance. He's recorded in this application for help as a rope spinner who is wholly disabled. So all of that information is tying up. Age, his occupation. So that's really, really important to constantly be checking, particularly a name like a Donald Sutherland in Caithness or Sutherland. So constant cross-checking between all the documents, very important. Within the record of applications, the most informative column within these is often the column entitled Any Other Information to enable the parochial board to decide this case. So basically, is there anything we need to know that might swing whether we say yes or no to support? This column will often record family members, any other income, any extenuating circumstances, things like that. And for Donald Sutherland, this column reads, applicant who has been deserted by his wife, is unable to work for his own support through rheumatism, etc. Has worked with William Sinclair at the old rope works for a considerable time and is well known to several members of the committee. And so it was agreed that Mr. Sutherland was entitled to receive some support, and he was added to the parish's General Register of Poor. And at that point he's given a number. He is number 1376, a number that is assigned to a person while they're in the system. And that's very, very useful because it means that now we can use that number to do all our cross-checking and to look him up. And the General Registers of Poor are organised by number, so it's a very quick way into the system. So when we have a quick look at the Wick Parochial Board, it confirms that Donald Sutherland was admitted onto the Poor Roll, the General Register of Poor, with an allowance of 2 shillings per week. And then using his allocated number, 1376, we can now turn to that register and find out the application details. So within the General Register of the Poor, the top half records the kind of personal details of a person. So it will say here, it says Donald Sutherland, resident at Telford Street, age 55, admitted on the roll on the 19th of January 1880 until the 14th of May. So he only gets given a few months' support. It notes that he's born in Wick, that he's a Protestant, that he's married, he's a rope spinner, and he's wholly disabled through rheumatics and wholly destitute with no earnings. It confirms his wife's surname as Innes, as we saw on his death certificate, and it adds a little bit of information that she is from Canisby. Again, that thing of every document just adds a little bit more information. It's always worth checking all of them because you'll get maybe something that you don't find somewhere else. So that's the top half of the page of the General Register, and there's one page per person. And then on the bottom half of each person's page is a running update of change of circumstances, subsequent proceedings, things that were given to that person, whether the allowance was changed. And we can see that Donald Sutherland, who should originally have stopped receiving poor relief allowance in May, instead seems to have worsened, because from going from outdoor relief and getting that money in his own home, he is then offered the option of indoor relief admission to the poorhouse on the 4th of February 1880, which he accepted. We can then go to the register of the poorhouse inmates, which shows him being admitted in a weak condition. And it seems that he would remain there for the last year of his life, because his final entry in the General Register of Poor simply says, off, dead. It's also recorded in the poorhouse register, and that of course ties up with the death certificate that we started with. I found it really interesting. I've seen many of these, and they always have that very kind of abrupt ending, off the roll, dead. But I found it very interesting that even though he was well known to the board, and they note that in his application, he's known to many members of the committee, there's still no room for compassion in the record keeping. The record keeping is not about sympathy for what's happened or anything like that. He's just off the roll, dead, because that is what the role, the information the system needs at that point. And it's clear that Donald Sutherland simply got to the point where he had no other choice but to receive indoor relief and go into the poorhouse. There are no references throughout his application to family members who could support him, no indication that his poor health or his weak body was going to be able to improve. And so we often see that frailty due to age or ill health plays a part in this system. And that's the case, as in other scenarios as well, where that's the case, the board would be looking for family members. The board are looking for somebody else who can take the responsibility and the cost of caring for this person, particularly if they think they're not going to get better. If we look at the Halkirk Parochial Board records of February 1861, we can find Barbara Campbell, or Budge, a farmer's widow, aged 60, who's partially disabled, and she's asking for assistance. So again, somebody who is, I think, what did I say she was? She's age 60, so she's no great age, but the fact that she is a widow and that the main income earner has gone is what's playing a part here. Partially disabled. So the application notes that she has no dependents, but that she has 11 children who do for themselves and help their mother, who yet has a small crop. So she's still trying to run the farm. And as you might expect, with all of those potential children, all those 11 children, the application is refused. And the minutes note that if she persevered, she was to be offered the poorhouse. And that very much says to me there's an implication there that whether you take that poorhouse offer or not will indicate how much you're actually in need. So we know that the elderly, the widowed, the physically weak might need to apply for assistance. But there are people of all ages in these records. There are new single mothers who have no other means of support or income. There are those afflicted with imbecility or insanity or lunacy, all those words used. And there are people who fit into several of those categories, like Maggie MacLeod. Maggie MacLeod lived in Whitegar, and her sister applied for help for her on the 27th of October 1904. And we often find that as well, that it's not necessarily people applying for their own support. There may be someone else looking out for them. She was aged 23. She was single, she was Protestant, and she had a child of under 7 days old. And Maggie MacLeod is listed as being wholly disabled by insanity, and she was sent to Montrose Asylum in December 1904. That's recorded on both her application for relief and her entry in the General Register of Poor. The poor relief system having the responsibility for all those unable to support themselves, whether through weakness, through ill health, or through insanity. And there's a couple of interesting things to note about this case. The first thing is to note that Maggie MacLeod is removed to Montrose Asylum, not the asylum I usually talk about, Inverness District. And that's because Caithness patients didn't go to Inverness District Asylum, they went to Montrose. And therefore their patient records are not held by us or held in the Highlands, they're held by Dundee University. It's such an interesting anomaly, and I'm not sure why. I've never yet dug deep enough into it to find out why Caithness patients went to Montrose, which is not at all convenient, as opposed to just coming down to Inverness like the rest of the Highlands and Islands did. But the other interesting thing to note about Maggie MacLeod is in the column previous addresses, it mentions all the farms that she's previously worked at. So she's a farm servant. And it says that she has previously worked at Upper Gillock, at Oldfield Farm, at Knockdee, at Sordale. So a huge amount of information that you could pursue if she was a family member of yours. Quite often, for farm servants, as anyone will know who's got them in their family, they can be quite hard to track down because they are sort of itinerant, they move between different farms, different areas. And so to have that list of all the previous places she's worked at just opens a whole wealth of other avenues to explore. So Maggie's application for assistance was on the 27th of October 1904, and we know that in December 1904 she was moved to Montrose Asylum with childbed insanity recorded as the cause. Interesting that they're breaking that down not just into general insanity, but they know it's connected to giving birth to the child. And her entry in the General Register of Poor states that she had become insane after the birth of her son on the 13th of October. It notes that her parents had been willing to keep her when she was harmless, but not when she started to show signs of becoming dangerous. But if that all sounds very heavy and very depressing, I've got a bit of good news for you. Maggie was cared for in the Montrose Asylum until the 12th of July 1905, so about five and a half months, when she was recorded as being recovered and removed into the care of her brother and no longer appearing on the poor relief roll. So it sounds to me, with my no medical degree at all, but it sounds to me like something like postnatal depression. And just being in that system for 5 months has brought stability in some way, and she's been recovered. I'm moving now to a different story. I am conscious of the time. I'll try not to go on much, but I might go on a little bit. Moving on to the story of 3 children, the Gow children, who came to the attention of Latheron Parochial Board in December 1906. Mary D. Gow, Donald J. Gow, and John C. Gow lived in Leibster, where they were cared for by their grandmother after being orphaned. They were awarded 1 and 6 each weekly, and their grandmother was allowed 3 shillings per week for their care. So again, it's that general category of people who can't care for themselves, whether that's the frail, those in need of asylum care, or children who have no adults responsible for them. And when they appear on the General Register of Poor, Mary was aged 9, Donald aged 7, and John aged 5. And as usual, we find information replicated. So that's what I'm saying, from the applications to the General Register to the minutes, you might find the same sort of information recorded. But again, that allows us to constantly double check that we're speaking about the same people. And also, as I said before, often a little bit of additional information within a different record type. So you're always adding little bits to the puzzle of the story of that person. So in the General Register of Poor, we find that the children's parents were called Donald Gow and Jessie MacLeod. And we also learn that the reason they were eligible for support from Latheron Parish was because their father had been born there. And I was listening to a really interesting podcast the other day that was talking about poor relief in England, and the fact that when a couple got married, and then again when they had children, every member would take the father's parish of settlement, because it meant that in the event of something happening, they weren't separated. Because if you were from, again, a farming family, say, and you were moving from place to place and you had a child in different parishes, if you all went to your, if the father died, you all went to your parish of birth, you could all be split up. So quite interesting. So we see the Gows here all being sent to Latheron Parish, or being supported by Latheron Parish, because that's where their father had been born. And when children were added to the General Register of Poor, unlike other people, when children were added to the General Register, they were also put in a separate, discrete register called the Children's Separate Register, and each parish would have had a children's separate register as well, so that they could go to one place to look at the children in their care. So when we turn to the Children's Separate Register, we again find a little bit more information about each child. When we look at Mary's page, we can find out that the grandmother who was caring for them was called Anne Sinclair. It's noted that she is caring for all 3 of the Gow children, but not caring for any other children. So probably just to clarify that she is doing it for family reasons, not, that's not her occupation. She's not kind of fostering children. Mary's entry also reveals that she is attending Leibster Public School, so we could then also use that information to go and see what information is in the poor records and follow that story. It's all about links across records. But also, as with the adults I've mentioned, we can see the end, the outcome of each child's story within their time in the poor relief system by looking at these records. So Mary's entry reveals that she was removed from the role on the 2nd of July 1913 as she had gone into service. This was about the age of 15. And the minutes show that the board had tried really hard to place her somewhere. Now that's either, and probably a bit of both, to give her a future out with the poor relief system, and also probably to get her off their expenses. So there's this entry from the 28th of April 1913 in the minute book. Letter of the 23rd inst from Quarriers Homes stating that they have no homes for girls. No homes for girls of Mary D. Gow's age. Also a letter from the local government board in the same case. So they try to put her into a Quarriers home, but they don't have any space. And then in June of 1913 we find letters of the 5th, 15th, 23rd, 29th from the Board of Agriculture, all in regard to getting Mary Gow of Leibster into the domestic training school in Aberdeen. But then there's this entry from not that much later. They're waiting for a response from the domestic college. But they say application had been made to the Board of Agriculture to get Mary Gow admitted to the domestic training school in Aberdeen. But in the meantime, the girl had been engaged with the Sutherland Union Inn in Leibster as a domestic servant for 6 months. Informed us that he had told the local government board and the Board of Agriculture. So if they've been trying to find a place, she has found work within a local inn, which kind of feel a bit better about that than her having to go off to Aberdeen or to a Quarriers home to train when her 2 brothers are still around. So that's Mary. She goes off the roll in 1913. What about the 2 brothers? Donald came off in May 1913. He was readmitted in March 1916 for a couple of months, but finally was removed in September 1916 and doesn't appear again. John, the little one who was 5 when he first entered into the role, he's got a little bit of a more enigmatic final entry written in red pen across the bottom of his page in the Children's Separate Register. On the 19th of December 1913, it says, "Off roll, sent to Mars." So, slightly random, but we can turn to the minute book to find out a little bit more about why this child was sent to Mars. The entry from the Parochial Board Minute Book of December the 29th, 1913 reads, "Letter of 13th inst from the Chairman approving of our pauper John C. Gow being sent to a training ship. Read, and the Inspector stated that all the members of the Emergency Committee approved and that the boy was sent by the Sheriff to the Mars training ship on the 19th. And to give a little bit more background information about what that means, this is the mission statement, if you can use such modern parlance, but this was what the purpose was of the Mars training ship. The ambition behind this ship was to give the poor and unfortunate a chance of a brighter future by providing structure to their lives and an education. The Mars would ideally train boys to join the Royal Navy or the Merchant Marine Corps on their discharge. The age of the boys admitted was normally between 10 and 11, and their discharge date approximately on their 16th birthday. There's another entry further down that shows the local government board had requested that the boy stay with his grandmother, but when they heard that he'd been sent to the Mars ship, they acknowledged it, and as far as we know, that's where John stayed. But just take a little moment to turn over in your head if you know any 10-year-old boys, and the image of kind of shunting them off into a training ship to be fit for the Royal Navy. It's not that long ago, 1913. And I'm going to finish with one last story, so I will go a little bit over. And once again, as it did in all of these cases, I want to finish with one where the parish of settlement plays a part. Where you're born, where you've lived, how does that suddenly become important when you are in a position you didn't expect to be in, where you need support? So this is the case of Alexander Bruce, who was passed from pillar to post, trying to get support. We know of his case through the record of applications for Bower Parish. Alexander Henry Bruce was aged 33 at the time of his application in July 1903. He's listed, as always, we'll look at the age, the occupation and so on. So he's listed as a Protestant and as a soldier, now pensioner. So he's on an army pension at the age of 33. He's recorded as being married to Jessie Swanson, aged 31, and having no children. He's recorded as being disabled by lunacy and wholly destitute. And there's some interesting detail in his application. We can see that his father was Henry Bruce, now deceased, and his mother, a Catherine Stephen, who had remarried a Mr. Cunningham and was now resident in Glasgow. So again, from a family history point of view, huge amount of information to follow up there that you might not stumble across anywhere else. But what's interesting about Alexander Bruce's case is that his address is listed as Edinburgh Castle, which is clearly not in the Highlands. So how does he appear in the Bower parish records? Well, his place of birth is listed as Bower, and the application to Bower parish has been made by the Edinburgh Inspector of Poor. So again, he hasn't made this application himself. He's obviously been referred to the system in Edinburgh. Edinburgh have said, well, we're not paying for you if we don't have to. You were born in Caithness, so we're going to refer it up there. And it's recorded that Alexander Bruce has only been resident in Edinburgh Castle for 2 weeks. So prior to that, he was in the Queen's Barracks in Perth, where he was for 5 years. So you can see why Edinburgh doesn't want the burden of paying for his care, especially if they're saying that it's lunacy and they're saying that he's 33. That's potentially a lot of years' care for someone who's only been with them a very short time. But Bower obviously felt that they didn't need to have the responsibility for him either, because in the column that says how disposed of, it says refused, referred to local government board for arbitration, and then it notes that the case was finally settled in Perth. So my assumption is it's because he had spent all that time in Perth. He'd been there for 5 years. Maybe he'd been away from Bower for a very long time. I don't know. But it would be interesting to then follow that case up and then get into the mental health records as well and see if there are notes there. It's a great example of how records tie up, not only within our own service, but across archive services. So you could trace him in his military records, through birth, marriage and death, through the poor relief records in Caithness, in Perth and in Edinburgh, and then potentially in mental health records as well, and that's all before he's 35. So a very interesting way to track somebody. And it's something that I've said before, an encounter with any of the systems, the government systems like asylums or poor relief, it undoubtedly was difficult for the person at the time. But what it does do is it leaves us with a paper trail that we can use to uncover stories about that person's life. I was working in the search room in Inverness the other day, and a gentleman came in who was interested in some family members who had been in the asylum. And we found a huge amount of detail. He was quite emotional about it. I was quite emotional about it. And he said to me, I know more about these two than I know about anybody else in my family tree because of the record keeping at the time. And many of these people in asylums and poor relief, we discover because they either died in that state or because they were in that state at the time of a census. So how many of us have people within our family trees who were in and out of the poor relief system, for example, but because it was not in a census year, because they didn't die there, we're just unaware that those records sit there about them. In 1929, the Local Government Scotland Act abolished the parish councils, and poor relief was instead administered by local authority public assistance committees. And then, of course, in 1948, the National Assistance Act abolished poor law altogether, and we started with the welfare state. So, some fascinating stories. I hope you have enjoyed hearing them. Thank you again to Val for the work she had put into this, which I was able to take bits from and add bits to, so I'm grateful for that. I hope you can join me next week. I will be looking at diaries in the Fraser Tytler collection. As you will know if you've been watching for many episodes, it's my absolute favourite collection, and there are, my mind, despite knowing the collection well, is blown by how many exciting diary entries there are. So, the diaries in Fraser Tytler next week. Apologies for running over. Thank you for saying hello to me. I really appreciate it. It makes me feel like I'm not on my own. And a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then thank you very, very much. It is so much appreciated. and I'll see you next week. Thank you.